Yep, it says it.
All right, perfect. Okay, we are live. All right, welcome everyone to 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And yep, we are joined. We are joined by one of the, if not the greatest, anti-war activists and anti-imperialist thinkers of our time. David Swanson, who's part of the organization World Beyond War, and is the host of the Pacifica outlets called Talk Nation Radio, right, David?
Right.
Okay, perfect. And we are going to be, we're going to be talking about imperialism and propaganda and so forth, and look at it from a historical point of view. So, David, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks. Sorry, I'm all sweaty. My kids had a Father's Day scavenger hunt. I could just barely do in between interviews there. So.
Oh, no problem, no problem. Well, all right. Well, let's get into it so that you can get back into fatherly duties. All right. So then, okay. My first question, David, is why isn't World War I talked about all that much in popular political discourse? And do you think it's because it was such a farcical war that only a few elites gained from, the French, the British, and the Americans, that it's just not talked about much, even though it is commemorated and celebrated because the good guys, supposedly the Allies, won that war?
Well, I think in part it's not needed. In part, it damages the central focus of pro-militarism propaganda, which is World War II. And in part, the propaganda around it has never been developed as well after it. It's sort of an Iraq war. What was unique about the Iraq war in the minds of millions and millions of people, especially in the United States, is that it was based on lies. That this was somehow different from every other war. Of course, every war that's ever happened has been based on lies. Usually, very different lies before it, during it, and after it. And what was unique about the Iraq War, the 2003 stage of the endless war on Iraq, was how bad they were at lying and how rapidly and definitively the lies were refuted, right? And World War I was really the first war that was marketed with a modern propaganda campaign, very sophisticated for its time and not that different from now. And it was all about a war to end all wars, and there wouldn't be wars anymore, and the world would be safe for democracy. And of course, the wars just rolled right on. And so you need propaganda for World War I after the fact that's very, very different from what sold World War I before the fact. And that's always hard to do. And as I said, 99% of the pro-war propaganda in the United States for the past 75 years has been tied to World War II. It's the top subject of movies on Netflix and Amazon, comic books, history books, scholarly books, novels, poetry, songs. It's, there was a few years ago, there was a girl in Italy who won like the Miss Italy pageant or whatever. And they asked her, what period of the past would you like to have lived in? And she said World War II, of course. What else could she possibly have said? What else is glorified, thousands of times, on her computer screen? And yet she was, just viciously mocked for being an idiot who wants to be bombed, right? Wow, you want to go back and get bombed. But what else could she possibly have said? It's World War II, World War II, World War II. And World War II has to be depicted as something that the good, noble, anti-fascist lovers of Jews and communists were reluctantly dragged into, and it was inevitable and unavoidable, and every wise, efficient means of avoiding it was tried, and it was a last resort. But if you introduce the existence of World War I into the conversation, a war that nobody tries to go back and defend, and the stupidity of which, and the stupidity of the Treaty of Versailles, conclusion of which had wise people predicting World War II on the spot, almost down to the year, so that World War II really was a continuation of World War I. Well, yeah, it ruins the World War II story. So I think that may have something to do with it.
And yeah, perfect. And I completely agree with you. And we're going to return to World War II and how that's cynically used to justify more imperial wars and wars in general. But can you talk a little bit then about the hidden history of World War I? And when I mean the hidden history of World War I mean the huge anti-war movement that existed in World War I, which I would say is as noble and as laudable as the mass popular opposition there was to the Vietnam War and the very beginnings before the Iraq invasion of 2003.
Yeah, World War I was a huge war for its time, or any time, and it was, as I said, the first major modern propaganda campaign. But it was also the first major anti-war campaign, and most people focus on how disappointing it was because there was so much commitment to peace and anti-war and universal global anti-nationalist brotherhood, sisterhood before World War I, and so much of it evaporated. And the women's rights movements that were demanding the right to vote, the 3/4 of them sort of, self-censored in order to cheer for the war, and then came back to demanding the vote after the war. Nonetheless, there was a huge amount of anti-war activism, principled opposition. Remember, this was a war in the United States that if you spoke against, you could go to prison. If you
that was the Espionage Act, which they're using which they did use to silence Chelsea Manning, and are going to use, heaven forbid, Julian Assange gets sent to the U.S., right?
Indeed, one of the brutal anti-democratic laws that was put in place during World War I was that one, which has been used increasingly of late, in particular during the Obama years, to go after whistleblowers, which is, absurd, an absurd use of that absurd law. But this was a war where you couldn't speak against it. You couldn't discourage anyone from joining in it, or you couldn't tell anyone to resist the draft. You would go to prison. You couldn't print negative stories about it in the newspapers.
Oh,
right?
Wow.
I mean, this is part of how Hitler rose to power after World War I came out of the German shock. Right, because if you live in Germany and the German newspapers are saying Germany's winning, Germany's winning, Germany's about to win tomorrow, Germany's about to win tomorrow for years, and then Germany loses, well, something dramatic happened. Surely it wasn't Germany actually losing. Surely the Jews betrayed us, right? And if you lived in the United States and you're just reading, the United States is about to win tomorrow, the United States is about to win tomorrow, for a year or more, and that's what people had to be told. Legally, you may know why the Spanish flu was called the Spanish flu, do you?
Enlighten me. I'm a student of history, so go ahead.
Well, this was a deadly disease like coronavirus that came out of the U.S. military, U.S. training bases, troops preparing to go to World War I in Europe, brought this disease with them from the U.S. military bases in the United States. Almost certainly, this is the general consensus at this point, from which it spread to all the countries of Europe and the world that troops went back to and visited other people who had contact with them, and it spread around the world, and it spread back to the United States. And there was this huge parade in Philadelphia, which was a huge success in contrast to the Trump rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma yesterday, as we're speaking. And the doctors all said, don't hold a massive rally with troops just back from the war and crowds of people. You're going to create a disease pandemic in the United States. And the politicians said, we'll just put up signs that say, don't cough, don't sneeze, and don't spit, and it'll be okay. Right. So it's very, very similar to what you're seeing today between doctors and politicians. Well, they held the parade. The disease spread like mad. It spread even into the White House. Several people in the White House got it, including almost certainly, we can't swear to it, but almost certainly Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, wow.
Woodrow Wilson, the president, who's just treated like a saint, like the Barack Obama of his time when he visits Europe, right? Woodrow Wilson, who's planning a peace without victory, an end to war. The French and British demand for vengeance against Germany will be stopped. We will have fair and equal treatment. We'll have an eternal peace. So Wilson goes to Paris to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. And what does he do to put up this struggle against French and British vengeance and a cruel treaty and mistreatment of Germany that will bring on another war? He lies in his bed, hacking and coughing and dying because he's got the Spanish flu. And why is it called the Spanish flu? Because in Spain, the newspapers were allowed to print stories that weren't all sunshine and rainbows. You could print things in Spanish newspapers that were bad. And so because the Spanish newspapers were talking about the flu that was everywhere, it's called the Spanish flu, just as a little reward for them for being too honest. And so when yesterday Trump tries to hold a remake of that rally in Philadelphia, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and hundreds of thousands of teenagers across the United States sign up for tickets planning not to go so the seats will all be empty, and they do it, and the place is largely empty. That's a health measure, right? I mean, it's a health measure in terms of the health danger of fascism, but also the health danger of the deadly disease that Trump in his speech says, just openly says, I've tried to cut back on testing because when you test for it, people find out that it exists, right? How many people in the United States have suffered and died because of the gross lack of testing, which is way out of proportion to all other wealthy countries that are testing more, right? The United States is the worst at handling the coronavirus according to the known statistics. But the known statistic, apart from Sweden, which is consciously trying not to handle it, and apart from a handful of countries in Latin America and the Middle East, but among wealthy countries,
Brazil and Britain as well have also handled it terribly.
Yeah, well, it's the numbers are of course wildly worse than Trump says. He just lies, but they're also worse. They would be worse if you had the same level of testing. And he just openly says, I'm not, and what is the resistance in Congress to? Well, we'll release a strongly worded statement. It's so the parallels are incredible between World War I and now, but there are peace organizations like the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom that came out of that period, and the traditions of conscientious objection, and resistance in the prisons, and Eugene Debs, who got a significant share of the votes for president from prison.
He was the candidate for the Socialist Party.
For the Socialist Party for U.S. president, right? I mean, he like 5 or 6 times he was, but one time was from prison, where he was for having spoken against World War I. Yeah.
And how much of the vote did he actually? How much of the vote did he get when he ran from prison?
I think he got nearly 1 million votes, and at that point, a presidential race wasn't. You didn't have to get 50 million votes. You had to get like 10 or less million votes. That's and it was, it's again another story that's not widely talked about because it messes up other important stories, is the extent to which the U.S. civil rights movement came out of the conscientious objectors in the prisons in World War II, who were following in the footsteps of the conscientious objectors in prison in World War I, and the extent to which it was it was the, when Trump uses chemical weapons against his own people, across the street from the White House a few weeks ago, which is, the most popular reason for bombing countries in Washington, D.C. is somebody used chemical weapons against his own people, or at least we claim they did. Using chemical weapons in Washington, D.C. has been popular since the veterans of World War I went and demanded their bonuses from the U.S. government, and the future heroes of World War II, Eisenhower and Patton and these guys, MacArthur, used tear gas and so forth on the veterans, men, women, and children hurt and killed, and the reason that the veterans of World War II got bonuses and free college and all sorts of good treatment is because they didn't want them in the streets again, like they were after World War I, when they were, when Wall Street was trying to move them actually to attack the White House and overthrow Roosevelt, and so the prisoners during World War II were being tortured in U.S. prisons for refusing to participate in World War II, some for religious reasons, some for non-religious reasons, just principled reasons against war. They got together, black and white, and integrated the prisons and refused to cooperate with any orders in the prisons facing torture unless the prisons were integrated and the prisoners of African ancestry were treated decently. And it was these people who came out of those prisons who started the civil rights movement in the 50s.
That is, wow. That is really remarkable. And I also have to I also should add that a lot of the popular anti-war movement that existed in World War I, many of them were such a broad left-wing movement of like social anarchists, communists, social democrats, people like Emma. I think Emma Goldman was her name, who was an early advocate of the Russian Revolution, later disavowed it when it devolved into tyranny, and because there was such a popular mobilization against World War I, especially in the United States, because many rightly argue that it was just that if the U.S. had joined the war, it would be nothing more than fighting for French and British imperialism. And lo and behold, that was true when, the French and the British got all of those colonies from the Ottoman Empire. And then that led, of course, to what was known as the Lost Generation during what was known as the Roaring '20s, and why so many did not, vote for the Democrats and voted for these incompetent, rival oligarchs, which was the Republican Party under Warren G. Harding, right?
Yes, indeed. In between the war makers, Wilson and Roosevelt, there were three Republicans in the White House. And Emma Goldman wasn't put in prison, but she was kicked out of the country. This was the other alternative for people who spoke against the war. If they were immigrants of any sort, you kick them out of the country. But it wasn't just this wide array of people on the left that you talk about opposing World War I and opposing war after World War I. It was on the right as well. In the U.S., there was this label of isolationist that ever since has been used to characterize opponents of war. If you're not for bombing people, you're for abandoning them and ignoring them and isolating, as if cooperating with people isn't an option. As if
yeah. I believe I'm thinking of Dr. Ron Paul right now, and even though I completely don't want a lot of his economic policies, I know he was always called that. Like, how can you be against war? Are you an isolationist, Dr. Paul?
Right. Well, I mean, he's against everything, so I'm with him on the bad things and not with him on the good things. But if you're, this is what they say to you: if you don't want to bomb people, which is the noble humanitarian thing to do, then you're an isolationist. But back then, during and after World War I, there was a serious contingent in the country and in the Congress of isolationists who actually wanted cooperation and treaties and trade and so forth, but they didn't want wars and they didn't want alliances like those that had dragged countries into World War I. They didn't want something like NATO created, where if one country gets into a war, the other countries are obliged, as a matter of good neighborliness, to join in the war too. They wanted bipartisan treaties. Your country and our country, we won't go to war with each other. They wanted universal treaties that said no war. They didn't want the League of Nations. They didn't want the World Court, because those placed the U.S. on the same level as other mere non-U.S. countries. Right. The UN, a generation later, the United Nations was okay because the US and 4 other countries got special privileges, veto power, and so forth. That if they had had that with the League of Nations, it would have been all right. But the peace movement in the United States and in much of Europe and around the world in the 1920s, right after World War I, was the biggest we've ever seen. Bigger than the 60s and the 70s, bigger than 2004, 2005, 2006. I mean, just unprecedented activism, mainstream, bankers and college presidents, and so, and right wing and left wing, the isolationists and the internationalists, they all wanted peace. And there was all these endless efforts and schemes and contests for peace plans and disarmament conferences that failed, and all sorts of peace efforts that failed. The one thing that worked, to the extent that it did, and it was a much greater extent than we're told, was something that started out as a treaty just between the U.S. and France. That was demanded by the peace movement, which was a treaty that would criminalize war, that would outlaw war, that would make war illegal. Because up through World War I, war was generally considered sort of something like the weather. It's not illegal, it's not legal, it just sort of happens. We can't help it. We organize millions of people to make it happen, but we can't help it. And so the Secretary of State in the United States, Frank Kellogg, this Republican, midget, one-eyed, drunk, cursing lawyer, antitrust lawyer, Secretary of State, and the Foreign Secretary in France, Aristide Briand, they were pushed by peace activists who were working globally, internationally,
trying to make war illegal,
to ban war, and they came up with this treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and it was the single biggest news story of 1928. And all the nations of the world, the big nations of the world, and representing their colonies very hypocritically, got together in Paris, including Germany, including Russia. For the first time, you had the recognition that the Soviet Union existed, and you had Germany and France and all the flags flying together. There's this song in the 50s. Last night I had the strangest dream, and all the men had gathered together to ban war. This was a real scene. It happened in 1928 in Paris, France. And the hardcore peace activists were outside protesting. The women were outside protesting. It was all old, rich, white men, But they banned war. They made war illegal with no exceptions, right? Not like the UN Charter, where if this institution authorizes it, it's okay. Or if somebody pretends it's defensive, it's okay. No, just it's banned, right? The idea that the activists had who made this happen was, we got rid of dueling between individuals, and we didn't keep defensive dueling or humanitarian dueling. We just said dueling is barbaric. We get rid of it. We'll do this with war. We got rid of blood feuds. We get rid of all these barbaric practices, trial by ordeal, Catholic torture. We're going to get rid of war. And so they created this law called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and that succeeded because the internationalists were for it, the isolationists were for it, everybody was for it. Why shouldn't war be a crime? We make it a crime, then you can prosecute people. And the first time they used, and wars were prevented, some wars were prevented, others were not. And the first time it was used, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was used to prosecute anyone, was in Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II. And it was, prosecute the losers, call it the crime of aggressive war. So it was twisted from the crime of war to the crime of aggressive war. And it was twisted from prosecute anybody who participates in war to prosecute whoever loses the war. But in some ways it was.
It was only signed by France and the U.S. and that's why war still continued, or
no, it was expanded right away to include a couple dozen countries that all gathered on that day, August 27th, 1928, in Paris, France, and then it was quickly expanded to some around 80 countries. All the big countries of the world that existed in 1928, and their colonies, right, and their League of Nations mandates, and it was somewhat adhered to, somewhat violated, but it really ended conquest, especially after World War II. With certain glaring exceptions like Israel in Palestine and the United States and Britain taking Diego Garcia and various islands and territories for bases, but it virtually ended conquest. Conquest, pillaging, looting was legal up until 1928. And so when they created the United Nations and they built that building in New York, they had to rip out the seats and put in 4 times as many, because little nations were popping up across Africa and Asia, and because it was safer to be a little nation. Back in the 1920s, any little nation that freed itself from its colonial oppressors was just going to fall under some other colonial oppressor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But colonialism was on the way out, violent and nonviolent overthrows of colonialism, and it was safer to be a small country, and so you went from 50 countries to 200 countries, not that much time, and so the Kellogg-Briand Pact, it transformed international law and behavior, but if it's mentioned at all in history books, it's mentioned as a joke, a naive failure because it didn't end all wars immediately, right? As if you didn't have to create courts and laws and abide by them and develop it over time. It's as if they banned drunk driving and then one guy drove drunk and they said, oh, well, that didn't work, and tore it up. No, if the law doesn't work entirely, it's like, they've banned murder, thousands of years ago, and nobody mocks Moses as some naive, socialist idiot because he tried to ban murder and there's still murder. So let's tear that up and just allow murder. Nobody does that with other laws, just the law against war, right? But it's one of those stories that's not secret history. This was a bigger news story than Charles Lindbergh in that year, right? Flying a plane across the ocean. And the main purpose of that, flying the plane across the ocean, was a philanthropist trying to build brotherhood between the United States and France in order to get things done like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, right? Which, was a bigger story than anything else. Kellogg got the Nobel Peace Prize. Briand had already got a Nobel Peace Prize, didn't need another one. And it's just written out. It's just, there's so much history that like the CIA never admitted to, nobody knew, etc. And then there's so much history that was just the news, the big news, and it's, just written out, just intentionally forgotten.
Is there any? Are there any good history books that that discusses, or any that or have you written a book about the Kellogg-Briand Pact?
Well, the best two books I know about it, maybe the best one is the other one, but one of them was written by me, and maybe this is my arrogance or my ignorance of other books, but
Hey, go ahead. Hey, we all need to sell products. I need to sell this show, and you need and you have to make a living. So
if you go to davidswanson.org and you click on books, there's a book I wrote called When the World Outlawed War. It's a short little book, not a lot of footnotes or anything, just the story of how the peace movement did things in the 1920s in the United States and Europe, and how principled they were, how much they made moral arguments, how much they argued for the interests of distant people unlike yourself, how much they held political parties to account rather than joining one, all the techniques they used. And then there's a book that came out more recently, just a couple years ago, called The Internationalists. It was written by a guy I know, and we've done events together because of this common interest about the Kellogg-Briand Pact, a guy who's the dean of the law school at Yale University, and his co-author is a woman who's another law professor who's actually been the lawyer for the Pentagon. And so it's a very strange mix in this book, because they really document what I was talking about a minute ago, how big an impact this law had, which is, just widely dismissed.
And it's kind of the left-right coalition that Ralph Nader was arguing about, that we sort of need if we want to really put a lid on corporate tyranny, and even and even wars, and what the late Alexander Coburn always advocated when he was co-editor of Counterpunch, right?
Well, I like a lot of what both of those guys had to say and have to say. And Ralph Nader, he puts out a list of 10 or 20 books he recommends every year. And there was one year where he had that book of mine in there, When the World Outlawed War. So I think it is a topic he likes and agrees with. But this book, The Internationalists, it's got all sorts of U.S.-centric, U.S. exceptionalist, pro-war stuff in there, mixed in with this knowledge of how important the Kellogg-Briand Pact was. So it's quite a mix. You have to sort of, from my perspective, you have to take the good and leave the bad. The single biggest threat to the established order of peace in the world, according to this book and much of U.S. academia, is the brutal seizure of Crimea by Russia, right? Never mind that it was a voted for annexation with the deaths totaling a grand total of, wait for it, 0 people died, but in comparison with the war in Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq or Pakistan or the Philippines or Somalia, this is the big threat to peace in the world in the United States, is that Russia brutally seized Crimea from Ukraine and got away with it. This has torn down the institutions of law.
And of course, I am a critic of Putin and so forth, but we could argue that the reason why Crimea voted to join Russia, not stay with Ukraine, was because there was a brutal coup that happened in Ukraine, in which a lot of rabid, ultra-nationalist Ukrainians wanted to persecute, Ukrainians who who speak Russian and so forth, and many of these people said, no, thank you. We'll go with we'll go with this oligarch. We'll go back with with Russia.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want Russian troops in Crimea. I don't want a Russian base in Crimea. I don't want any troops in any military anywhere. I want them all abolished. I have plenty of criticism for Russia, its domestic policies, its international policies, but in comparison with the United States in the subject of war and peace, my God, it's not anywhere close. I mean, Russia spends, 5% what the U.S. does on militarism. The United States is a mad force of the United States is 3/4 of the weapons dealing around the world, and then the regions that we think of as violent, backward places where people have the wrong religion and the wrong skin color, and they resort to barbaric warfare. Well, they do it with U.S. made weapons. You couldn't be waging these wars in North Africa and the Middle East without the U.S. weapons. And the U.S. launches wars and refuses international laws, just orders of magnitude above anybody else. In the United States now, we have unprecedented, incredible, unexpected activism because of the quality of the videos of the police murders of Black people on the streets. When I was in Russia a few years ago, I saw this police car pull a car over on the street, and the guy in the car in front get out and run back to the policeman's door and start shaking his fist and yelling at the policeman, "What are you pulling me over for?" That guy would be dead. He would be dead, right? So, I can criticize Russia, but nobody in the Russian government cares much how I criticize them. But it's the comparison between the level of violence and the culture of violence and the structures of violence in the United States. There's no comparison. And the Russian government several years back approached me in Washington, D.C. and tried to get me to take stuff they wrote and publish it, and I openly blogged.
For what reason?
To spread their propaganda, to spread good news about Russia and bad news about the United States. And I openly blog for money, pay me to publish their stuff and pretend I wrote it. And I openly blogged about it and named names and said, this is ridiculous and awful and I'll never do it, and of course I won't. But if you say anything against U.S. war making or in favor of Russia in any way in the United States, you're immediately accused of getting paid by the Russian government, right?
And you are tarred and feathered online and so forth. But let's hopefully, if we have time, let's get back to we'll get back to Russia. But then going back to to World War, well, not so much World War One, actually. Yeah, let's get into some of World War II. Why do you think the Spanish Civil War then isn't taught that much? And do you think, like World War One, it's because the powers to be, the U.S., France, Canada, and Britain, although Canada was still arguably part of part of the British Empire, was because they enabled Franco with his with his German Italian backings to overthrow the Spanish Democratic Socialist government and republic, and then of course the Spanish Civil War. That's basically your introduction to World War II.
Yeah, I think just like World War One, it hurts the World War II mythology. Right, the mythology, it's not that World War II didn't exist and it wasn't horrible and the Nazis didn't murder people and so forth. The mythology in the United States is that the United States was always against the Nazis, always favored peace and harmony and anti-fascism, got into the war reluctantly out of the need to stop the Nazis from taking over the world and to save the people from the camps. And so the whole history of the 30s of the U.S. governmental and corporate support for fascism in Italy and Germany, and of course the support of U.S. corporations like IBM and GM and GE and ITT and so forth, right through the course of the war.
Koch brothers as well.
I'm sorry?
The Koch industries as well, the Koch brothers as well.
And the fact that the Nazis couldn't have taken the war into the Soviet Union without supplies from U.S. corporations, and couldn't have killed nearly as many people in the camps without the punch card system from IBM and so forth. And it does that story. These giant conferences held leading up to and through the course of the war, where the United States and all the other countries decided not to take the Jews. Right, and that the peace activists were demanding of the U.S. and Britain right through the course of the war, bring the Jews out, because this was before they wanted to kill them all, they wanted to expel them all. But nobody would take them. And when nobody would take them, They said, well, then they don't deserve any rights. Those hypocrites agree with me. You know, this was Hitler. Those hypocrites agree with me about the Jews, which of course they did quite openly. You know, not everyone, but the majority of people in the United States and in the U.S. government and in other governments around the world, just openly anti-Semitic. This has to all be written out of history. And so when you have the Spanish Civil War, where the Western governments either pretended to be neutral or openly supported the fascist side, and only the Soviet Union supported the anti-fascist side, and of course, with exceptions, with individuals, with volunteers, with whole brigades of volunteers from the United States and elsewhere who went and joined in the anti-fascist side. That story doesn't fit with the narrative. You know, you see, I've seen Winston Churchill very, very appropriately graffitied in recent days, along with all these other historical warmongers and racists, because they're racists. So apparently, if you can find some war that's not racist, everybody's cool with that. But if they're racist, but Winston Churchill in the United States, I mean, he's practically a Gandhian, peace-loving, anti-fascist. You know, he reluctantly used a little bit of violence because of his deep love for Jews and communists. I mean, this is the Winston Churchill we're presented with, right? And so the whole Spanish Civil War doesn't fit the story.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And so perfect segue to this next question, which is, I mean, also, with World War I, like you mentioned, the brutal economic collective punishment of Germany, the brutal austerity of that period led, of course, to the ultra-nationalist backlash, which was Hitler, and then we're in World War II. So then, what are your reflections on World War II being seen as the good war, and how do you think, and do you think that because World War II is considered the good war, and because you have all these Hollywood propaganda films and the occasional good film which does show the suffering of the victims of war, like Roman Polanski's The Pianist, that World War II has become cynically used for more imperial wars under the banner of R2P and of course peacemaking and so forth?
Well, I don't know how anyone could dispute it. And we're at World Beyond War. People can go to worldbeyondwar.org. We're going to do an online course late this year, I think October to November, 6 weeks or so, on debunking the use of World War II as a pro-war argument. Part of how you do that is to identify World War II as indisputably the worst thing in financial cost, injury, death, suffering, environmental destruction, creation of bad precedents and structures going forward that humanity has ever done to itself in any short period of time. And the notion that you can justify that as a good thing, or one side of it as a good and necessary thing, is outrageous. Part of So I like to approach it in a couple of ways. One is to start eroding some of those myths, the myth about the reluctance of the United States and the surprise by the Japanese and the concern for the victims in the camps, which never existed until in the government until after the war. And the other part of it is the irrelevance. I mean, we don't go back 75 years to find a legitimate example to justify anything else we do. But this is the single biggest expense of the U.S. government, and a major expense of other governments is war. And when you ask people why, the vast majority in the U.S. will admit to the horror and immorality and illegality of the past 75 years worth of wars. But then they'll just shout Hitler. They'll just walk up to you right to your nose and scream, Hitler, Hitler, as if that's an argument for taking another $1 trillion from our grandchildren's yet to be earned pay and dumping it in to more wars in the next year. It's incredible. And you're talking about a world where there were no nuclear weapons. There was colonialism and conquest was legal. Looting and pillaging were legal. There was no international law, no international agreements of the sort that exist today. And it was a completely different world. Right? It's like the people yanking down all the Confederate statues because that was the bad side of the U.S. Civil War. And they must glorify the Northern, I think it was, well, I don't want to say the city in case I get it wrong, even though I'm pretty sure. But somewhere in the United States in the past day or two, some group, yanked down a Union statue rather than a Confederate statue, apparently by mistake. And of course, they're being condemned for yanking down the wrong kind of mass murder statue, right? But if you're going to glorify the U.S. Civil War because it's been tied to ending slavery, at least partially ending a certain type of legalized slavery, and because everybody's in favor of that, even though much of the world did it without wars, that's okay. I don't care. Glorify a war glorify the U.S. Civil War, glorify World War II. But today, if we want to end mass incarceration, if your idea is to go find some big fields and kill millions of young people and then sit down and draft a bill to end mass incarceration, then we got an argument. But if you're with me that we should just jump straight to drafting the bill to end mass incarceration and skip slaughtering millions of people first, well, then I don't care what you think about the Civil War or World War II, right? But the problem with what everybody thinks about World War II is that they use it to justify more wars, right? Yeah. There hasn't been a U.S. war in these 75 years where it wasn't against the new Hitler, right? The new Hitler. Putin is Hitler. Assad is Hitler. Saddam Hussein was Hitler. And
of course we have to, and of course we need to bomb them. We need to then punish their people collectively, like what we did with Germany, World War I, Saddam Hussein, First Gulf War, those sanctions of mass destruction we did. Well, we had to do that to them because they were Hitler, and they were because they were Hitler. And if we didn't intervene sooner, there would have been a bigger genocide against Kurds and Shias, and of course the BS that that Assad is a murderous Alawite who wanted to wipe out everyone and anyone.
Well, he is murderous, but somebody committing murder doesn't excuse somebody else committing more murder. It's insane. You're supposed to justify what was going to be under Obama was planned, essentially carpet bombing the whole country of Syria on the basis of claiming that Assad had used the wrong kind of weapons. He used chemical weapons, right? If he had used good, noble, civilized napalm and fire bombs and nuclear bombs and guns and missiles from drones and cluster bombs for the children to find, well, then there wouldn't have been, but he used the wrong kind of weapon, so to bomb the whole country. I mean, this is the and of course, if I say one word against Assad, then I'm in favor of U.S. imperialism. And if I say one word against U.S. imperialism, then I'm an Assad lover. No, governments are all bad. There's not a good one that you can rank them, but they're all bad. But the sins of one don't justify the sins of another. And you don't legalize the biggest crime there is with some other crime, real or not,
So are you like me then, in which you have to avoid watching World War II commemorations and even World War II documentaries? And I even now I can't watch movies which are set in World War II because I know what the storyline is going to be. A Jewish person a Jewish person is being persecuted. Therefore, where are our knights in shining armors, the Americans and the British, to come save me? And even if they do show the atrocities of war, it still is, well, World War II is the good war, hence why we need to do something, and we need to get rid of Assad over here, Saddam Hussein over there, Gaddafi over here. And of course, we all know that that in the end of the day, those were all, imperial wars, and they were, yeah, yeah. Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's impossible to avoid World War II in U.S. culture, although you can try. But it's, this is the problem with the World War II argument. The worst problem with it is that it justifies anything and everything, total war. I mean, World War I was the last war that really resembled what people still think of as war. Teams of competing armies in different color uniforms on a thing called a battlefield. Most of the death and suffering is by the soldiers. World War II was the first war that's been what every war since almost has been. The vast majority of the suffering and dying is civilians. The war is happening in people's towns and cities and farms. And so World War II is the creation of this argument where you scream Hitler and it justifies anything, and it justifies not looking into what that anything is, because then you would be on the side of Hitler. So you do have Hollywood depicting war suffering, but not that much the suffering in Dresden when you burn it, not so much the suffering in Hiroshima or Nagasaki or any other Japanese city when you burn it. So it's victor's justice and victor's propaganda, and it's not that the losers weren't mass murderous criminals. It's that the victors were also mass murderous criminals who in some cases openly admitted that if they'd lost, they might have been prosecuted for their mass murderous crimes. And
they also enabled those mass murderers. I mean, Churchill hated Stalin, way more than he hated Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini.
Well, no question, within hours of the Nazi surrender, Churchill was proposing an attack using Nazi troops and Allied troops together against the Soviet Union. This is what he wanted, and the U.S. generals like Patton were completely on board. This was, the Soviet Union was the real enemy, and this was true in elite circles in the United States through the 30s and up, until World War II, up until, the business interests were so aligned with Britain, and the Soviet Union was fighting the enemy of Britain in Germany, that Germany really had to be the enemy, but only until that moment when it was over. And then the idea was to start attacking the Soviet Union every which way possible, and to bring as many of those German slave-using mass murderous scientists and warriors into the U.S. military before the Soviet military got them, right? So, the story of
that's what Stanley Kubrick was mocking mercilessly in Dr. Strangelove, was that, spoiler alert in case anyone hasn't seen it, but Dr. Strangelove is a Nazi war criminal because that's what the U.S. did. They recruited actual Nazis, war criminals, to build weapons of mass destructions and to fight Russia, Cold War.
Yeah, probably the best movie ever made, I think, Dr. Strangelove, and the formerly Nazi, now U.S. war scientist in the movie was modeled after Werner von Braun, who was a former Nazi who had used slave labor to make rockets for the Nazis to destroy London using materials from U.S. corporations, and who was then brought to the United States with hundreds of other Nazi scientists and was put in charge of a new thing called NASA, the space agency. They put all these Nazis, not all of them, but they put this huge number of the former Nazis into this town in Alabama called Huntsville, Alabama, where slavery was not, that big a deal really for some of the people, and they fit right in. It's not that the culture of the U.S. military was completely transformed from the angelic anti-fascists to this was still a segregated military at this point, or had just ceased to be, and it was that they fit right in. I mean, the United States was prosecuting Nazis in Nuremberg for things like human experimentation while engaging in human experimentation, which was acceptable if you were good civilized people, not if you were the Nazis who lost the war. So the hypocrisy is incredible.
This is why people don't watch Steven Spielberg's Lincoln and don't watch Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. David, how much more time do I have with you?
Oh, negative half an hour. I think I got to run. I got another show I got to do.
All right, no problem. We need to have you back. Then I guess then last question then is was Yugoslavia was actually no I'm gonna have to save that question for another time. Okay, then let's get into this question, which is, if we take down all the monuments glorifying the Confederate generals, Confederate secession, and so forth, shouldn't we do the same with the Founding Fathers, Mount Rushmore, J. Edgar Hoover, Columbus, and dare I say, shouldn't we change the American flag and also tear down Abraham Lincoln? Because as a guy who follows indigenous history and wants to be more involved in the indigenous anti-colonial struggle, Abraham Lincoln also was a white supremacist towards Native Americans, like all the other presidents before him and after him.
Well, I've written on this topic at enormous length. You can go to davidswanson.org. I've written an article called "Now That Charlottesville Can Take Down Monuments, Should It?" ? Where I lay out my plans, my dream for what would be done in this town of Charlottesville. And I actually don't care if the pro-war and pro-racist and pro-genocide monuments are destroyed. I actually would like them taken out of central public squares and put off in the corner somewhere with plaques explaining what's wrong with them, who put them up, why, what they were used for, and why we came to our senses and moved them over into this corner. And I would like there to be monuments.
I think I also endorse that idea as well, yeah.
And instead, in their place, or in addition, I would like there to exist some monuments to something other than wars and genocides. We don't, that's all we have in my town is monuments to wars and genocides. We don't have any monuments to nonviolent movements, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, educators, activists, athletes, musicians, artists, children, nothing, just wars and genocides. So, and I think when you put up new monuments, don't put them up to individuals, put them up to movements, put them up to ideals. Individuals are all flawed. We know this because we're all individuals, right? But put them up to movements and goals and ideals. That we should have a monument to peace in this town. We should have a monument to our sister cities. We should have a monument to activism, to education, to justice and love. Not monuments to particular past participants in genocides, because even if you still loved that particular genocide, there's all sorts of other horrible things about each of those individuals. So that's my recommendation.
All right. Well, David, I know that you have to go, but I hope that this will be the first of many conversations. We are definitely going to have you back, because after learning about the Spanish flu and Kellogg-Briand, we definitely need to have you back. And I already say this as somebody who, who's a huge fan of your work. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us thank you very much for joining us on 1+1. I really look forward to having you back, and I'll put a link to where people can find your work and where people can join the web events and donate to the organization. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.